Good morning and welcome to this, the third day of the Federalist Society's National Lawyers Convention. I'm Deane Reuter, Vice President, General Counsel, and Director of Practice Groups at the Federalist Society. I'm very pleased to welcome you back today and wish you a happy Veterans Day. I express my personal, heartfelt appreciation for all our veterans, and I ask you to join me now in a moment of silence. Thank you, and thank you to our veterans. In feedback on the convention thus far, the most frequently asked question concerns turnout. Just how many viewers do we have for each of our panels? The numbers are in for day one, and I'm pleased to report that attendance is robust. Day two numbers are still being counted. Frankly, that's taking a bit longer than I had hoped. In terms of results so far, though, while we'd be limited to the Mayflower Hotel's big rooms of 300 to 400 people per panel, and in the ballroom, perhaps 500 people for major addresses, we're averaging just over 1,000 attendees per panel on day one. There could be some recounting and refinement of those numbers, but I'm pretty sure they're firm. Of course, there's no charge to attend this year's convention online, so please continue to publicize it to colleagues and friends. On our agenda later today, as we approach the midway point of this year's convention, we'll get an update on labor and employment law from agency leaders. We'll also check in with thought leaders about the current state of intellectual property, with some emphasis on uncertainty in the field and what that means for businesses and others. We'll close our discussion today with a look at law enforcement and some of the challenges faced in the perplexing modern era. But first, we host our opening panel on China, brought to us by our National Security Law and International Law Practice Group, moderated by Judge Lisa Branch. Judge Branch sits on the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals after having served on the Georgia Court of Appeals. She spent time clerking and in private practice, but she's also got experience in the executive branch within OMB at OIRA, and perhaps more relevant for our purposes today, in the Department of Homeland Security. She's a regular at the Federalist Society National Lawyers Convention, and I'm so happy she agreed to participate again this year. Judge Branch.
Deane, thank you. Hello to our virtual audience and to the panelists. And as Deane noted, today is Veterans Day, and we honor all those who serve this country. I want to welcome you to the first panel of the third day that Deane walked you through the agenda for the day. Of the Federal Society Annual Lawyers Convention, which is entitled The Law, China, and the Possible New Cold War. Our country's shifting relationship with China over the decades has always been the subject of much news coverage. And today we'll examine how the rule of law figures into those complex interactions. We all know that the United States has at its foundation the rule of law, and the same is true of some other Western nations. But what about China? It has a legislature and courts, but with its institutions under political supervision and control, it has no rule of law as we define it. How does China's approach to the rule of law affect its relationships with other countries around the world? How should China's lack of a rule of law as we understand it influence the United States' approach to China? Our distinguished panel will address these themes during its discussion, and I will briefly introduce our three speakers in the order in which they will speak, but please note that they have much more detailed biographies that you'll find on the Federalist Society website. Each panelist will then deliver brief remarks I will then engage the panel in discussion before we turn to the audience for Q&A. And let me start with the introduction of the speakers. First up, we have Professor Julian Koo. He's the Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and is the Faculty Director of International Programs, and he is the Dean Distinguished Professor of Constitutional Law at Hofstra University School of Law. His primary research interest is the relationship of international law to constitutional law, and he's the co-author with John Yoo of Taming Globalization, International Law, the U.S. Constitution, and the New World Order. Professor Koo will focus on what China is doing in the United States. Our second speaker will be Congressman Mike Rogers. He is a former member of Congress representing Michigan's 8th Congressional District, and he previously served as an officer in the U.S. Army and an FBI special agent. While he was in Congress, he chaired the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and he currently serves as the vice chairman of the board at the MITRE Corporation and is a senior fellow at Harvard University, as well as the chair at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, where he directs the center's national security programs. Congressman Rogers will discuss China's efforts to gain influence around the world. And our third panelist will be Dr. Richard Haass. He is in his 18th year as president of the Council on Foreign Relations. From January 2001 to June of 2003, he was the director of policy planning for the Department of State and was a principal advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. He was confirmed by the Senate to hold the rank of ambassador, and he's also served as the U.S. coordinator for policy toward the future of Afghanistan and as U.S. envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. And from 1989 to 1993, he was special assistant to President George H.W. Bush and senior director for Near East and South Asian affairs on the staff of the National Security Council. And he will discuss focus on Chinese foreign policy. I will now pass the mic to the first speaker and then to Professor Koo, and he will then pass the mic to the next speaker in order. Professor Koo.
Okay, thank you so much, Judge Branch, and I want to thank the Federalist Society for inviting me back to speak at the National Lawyers Convention. The last time I spoke on a panel at this convention, I believe, was in November 2012, just after another presidential election where the Republican candidate, let's just say, didn't do as well as most members of the Federalist Society had hoped. So given this track record, I may not be back here for another 8 years, so I really do hope I'll try to make this opportunity count. So, possible Cold War with China is a huge topic. There are, so many different angles to it. There's the possible armed conflicts that might occur in Taiwan or South China Sea. There's competition for global dominance in the high-tech world. But I want to focus my comments, as Judge Branch mentioned, on one aspect of a potential Cold War that I think deserves a lot more attention, especially for members of the Federalist Society. And for decades, China has been engaged in sophisticated influence and espionage operations within the United States that are designed to advance China's economic and national security interests. And this is a real problem that we need to counter in effective ways. And I think the Trump administration has really made a lot of progress on this front. But I want to urge us, as we enter a new administration, to rethink and improve this approach so we can push back in ways that don't undermine our overall efforts to compete with China. So let me start by describing what I mean by Chinese influence and espionage operations. Influence operations, I mean Chinese state-sponsored activities to influence US public discourse and government policy in ways that benefits the Chinese government. And I'll just note the Chinese government is not the only foreign government to play this game, but it is the only one that's a real possible Cold War adversary. Now, there are two kinds of Chinese influence operations that are particularly troubling. The first kind involves buying influence in US higher education through the establishment of institutes, research partnerships, or other sort of funding from the Chinese government, or indirect funding from private Chinese-based groups that are allied or directed by the Chinese Communist Party One example of this effort is the establishment of Confucius Institutes for Chinese language training at around 65 to 75 universities across the US and around the world. So it's a good example of an influence operation, because it's essentially, it's just a way to learn Chinese. It's an institute designed to help you learn Chinese. But these institutes have also been accused of imposing a Chinese government censorship of controversial topics in the classroom. And here I think the institutes and the other sort of academic partnerships are troubling, because it's not so much the explicit censorship, which I think a lot of universities have managed to push back on, but I think going into partnership with Chinese government affiliated entities really has the effect of muting criticism of China on campus that might otherwise have occurred, certainly from university administrators, but also from faculty and students. So like one example, events with Chinese dissidents that might have been held or just not held because it's controversial. Academic conferences and subjects critical of China are going to discourage behind the scenes. Because this influence is subtle and largely unseen, I think this is one of the more pernicious ways in which we've seen Chinese government influence in US society in ways that are not beneficial to us, I believe. Now, the second kind of Chinese influence operation is much worse, but less subtle. This involves buying influence via prominent US political figures. It's a traditional type of influence operation. Sometimes this occurs through legal means, like hiring lobbyists in a way that's publicly disclosed and registered. China doesn't really officially hire lobbyists, but entities influential or affiliated with the party do. Or it might be illegal, such as the recent revelations just in September that former GOP figure Elliot Brody lobbied the US government on behalf of the Chinese interests to, among other things, extradite a Chinese dissident in the US back to China. He pleaded guilty recently to accepting money to lobby the administration on this issue without registering and disclosing that he's accepting that money. So these are types of influence operations, and if they're not really noticed, you might see the political discourse or the political system even adjust in ways that are not transparent to benefit China because of these sorts of influence operations. So at the same time the Chinese government has conducted these subtle influence operations, it's also succeeded in supporting both traditional and economic espionage operations. The past few years has revealed the Chinese government has successfully recruited at least 3 CIA agents to their cause, as well as a State Department employee. Meanwhile, Chinese hackers, of course, penetrated the Office of Personnel Management for personal data on US government employees. What really makes Chinese espionage efforts unique, though, is how China has sought to penetrate not the US government, not just the US government, but also the US private sector, seeking intellectual property and other valuable corporate trade secrets. I think they've done this not just over the past few years. Dozens of cases have been filed against Chinese nationals who've been alleged to have appropriated trade secrets from US companies for their own personal benefits, but also sometimes to benefit Chinese government entities. Just one example, they've also convinced prominent US scientists, like the chair of Harvard's chemistry department, to share cutting-edge research with the Bureau of Generous Research stipends, such as the professor at Harvard got a mere $50,000 a month plus $160,000 a year to help him do research on, share his research with them. And that's the type of thing that could buy a little bit of influence. Okay, so the point is, we don't know, the reason we know about these activities is not because of journalism or investigative reporting, but it's actually because of charges brought by the United States Justice Department. In particular, under the Trump administration, the DOJ has really wielded the Economic Espionage Act with great effect. Also, the administration started to use federal disclosure laws to push back against Chinese influence operations, really going after people for failing to register as a foreign lobbyist, failing to disclose that they received Chinese money, such as the Harvard chemistry professor. It even charged an NYPD police officer here in Long Island with spying on local Tibetans for the Chinese government. These were novel and innovative uses of existing laws that I think have had an impact on deterring and pushing back against Chinese espionage influence operations inside the United States. But my main point here I want to sort of focus on is, while this has been good, and the Trump administration deserves credit for really focusing on China's activities in the US and its use of existing laws to push back, I think there's a lot of room for improvement, not so much on the actual policies, which I fully support, but it's the messaging around these efforts that have been disappointing and in some cases counterproductive. So there's been some public messaging from top US government officials about China's threat in general, but there's not really been much explaining of how the US is fighting back by deploying its resources within existing laws and institutions that protect even suspected Chinese spies with the full gamut of US constitutional rights and due process. Indeed, to give one example, this past July, Attorney General Barr gave a long, important speech on China. But in this speech on China, he barely mentioned his own department's efforts in this regard. He didn't point out that his department's efforts to counter Chinese operations fully respects the rule of law and uses the US justice system. He did not point out that the department has to gather evidence, let defendants challenge that evidence in open court. And he's not pushing back against China. He needs to explain that we're not pushing. He didn't bother to contrast the US procedures and processes with the abhorrent Chinese government practices that they've used in recent years, which just, in many cases, completely ignore and disregard due process when they arrest both Chinese citizens, but also foreign citizens, US citizens, by accusing them of subversion and threatening national security, and then just throwing them in jail for 6 months without any chance to contest those charges. So why does such messaging matter? Because we need to keep in mind that the Chinese government is perfectly capable of flipping US counter-espionage influence operation efforts in a way to smear the US government and the United States' image within China. Nearly all the targets of counter-China initiatives are either Chinese nationals or naturalized Chinese Americans. And the efforts have already led to accusations by Asian American groups that the DOJ is conducting racially discriminatory operations. And the Chinese government has picked up on this and has been to paint the US efforts as motivated by racial animus rather than any real concern for national security. And meanwhile, the Chinese government can point to US politicians and leaders who regularly denounce our own institutions, including the Department of Justice and the FBI, as corrupt and political. And in this regard, I think the battle we've had over the past 4 years about what the DOJ is, its so-called corruption, the deep state, the FBI, has made it really difficult, I think, for the US government to promote the benefits and what's really great about the US justice system abroad. So it's easy for Chinese propagandists to take the words and tweets of our own leaders to paint all of the US efforts to counter Chinese operations in the United States as simply corrupt attempts to oppress and discriminate against Chinese people here, and to really denigrate the image of the United States in the eyes of Chinese people, including Chinese students living here in the United States. And so while the image of China and the United States has gone way downhill the last few years, it's also worth noting that the image of the United States and China has also noticeably dived in recent years, especially among younger Chinese. We're going the wrong direction. Older Chinese have a more favorable view of the United States than China, than younger ones do. And this is a terrible failure. Whatever the failings of our legal system, it's galling to me to read and listen to Chinese social media users dismiss the US justice system as corrupt and racially biased simply by quoting our own political leaders and also activists in our society. And that's too bad, because I think one of the most important components of US power in its competition with China is the fairness and reliability of our legal and political institutions, what Judge Branch mentioned, the rule of law. And so I hope the next administration will remember to deploy this power against China. It will require all of us, it will require better messaging, but also require all of us to take a step back before we tear each other apart. The more we tear each other apart at home, both metaphorically and literally, I think the harder it's going to be for us to compete with China on the global stage and to win a future possible Cold War. So that's it for me. Thanks so much for listening to me. Now I turn it over to Congressman Rogers.
Great. Well, thank you, Professor. I appreciate that. Thankfully, I got to my mute button early. Normally, I give the best part of my speeches are on mute, never to be recovered again. But I think I got to figure it out this time. Thanks so much, Judge Branch. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. And Ambassador, thank you as well. And thank you for your service, all of you. in what is the greatest democracy on the face of the earth. I just thought I'd talk a little bit about what some call the three pillars. The Chinese refer to it as the three warfares. And why this is important, because it has its components in the People's Liberation Army, but it's also really oriented from the Communist Party of China. And so they use all of the elements of government to try to pull this off. And so what they did in 2006, they did a comprehensive study, they being the PLA, and ability to fight back was absolutely incompatible with winning informationalized high-tech wars. So they just weren't keeping up on that front. And they decided, well, if we can't defend ourselves, so off an old playbook. The actual original language of these three warfares came in about 1963, and they decided that they were going to re-engage in what they're again calling three pillars or three warfares. So what they were going to do is preempt in the minds of foreign policymakers. To the professor's point, we call those information operations. And they were going to try to collapse organizations, meaning the trust in organizations. They were going to try to collapse them in the host countries of which they're concerned. They're going to blunt the determination of those countries to do beyond or what the Chinese might argue is aggressive behavior. And they did that by, again, dusting off these three warfares and then modernizing them. So it's now a module of what the PLA would perform in activities around the world. And so those three warfares are public opinion, both domestically, by the way, and internationally. So they have operations to do both. Psychological is the second. Think of boycotts. There was one specific that was interesting to me when they came out with their first anti-ship missile. They were noticing in the Iraq and Afghan war that Americans' tolerance for loss was significantly reduced. And so what they did is they deployed an anti-ship missile in the Guangdong province. It had never been tested against a moving target. So there had been tests to see that it actually functions and get where it's supposed to go, but never against a moving target. So if you're in military circles, that would be a huge drawback to that missile system, and maybe you would plan accordingly. But they promoted it, the Chinese government promoted it and promoted its ability to take out carriers. And they reminded people, this was really interesting. So if you take the Reagan Nimitz class aircraft carrier, about 5,000 people on board, sometimes as many as 6, cost $4.5 billion just to build it. That doesn't count any of the weapon systems that are on board. That would be, and if they could take out just one of our aircraft carriers like the Reagan, that's more than 15 years of deaths of U.S. service members in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so they started playing on the psychological aspect of, hey, you're going to go get into this mess. We've got bad news for you. You're going to lose 5,000 sailors in one swipe in one day with our new capability. There were still at the time military analysts saying, I'm not sure the thing will even work the way they say it's going to work. However, it had an impact. The Navy actually had to change the way it was maneuvering in the region. They also use boycotts. They talked to the Scandinavian countries about not buying something. Psychological battlefield in different ways, try to get in the minds of their enemies. And as Chairman Mao would say, to rally true friends against true enemies is our purpose. And that's what he was developing this three warfare system. And that last one is legal. And so the great example of this is that not necessarily taking something to court and trying to prove it in a court of law, of which we would all know and respect, but they're trying to do the court of public opinion on legal opinion. So they make the argument in their nation courts, in their national system, international court of courts, at least the influence of those courts, and the laws of war. And they use all of those old precedents and try to make a public case about why their policy is right and our policy would be wrong. The great example of that to me was the U.S. Bowditch. So they were arguing, China was arguing that the U.S. ship Bowditch, Navy ship Bowditch, was not able to go into certain navigable waters because it was against international law, it was against the laws of war, it was against their borders. And so they were making a legal public case on why that was true. And they focused primarily in the Pacific Rim, but they also used Europe and other places. And they have spent lots of money to promote this psychological public effort, law effort, through Chinese global TV, right? So it's not a part of the PLA, but it is a part of the Chinese Communist Party effort. And they have 100 different journalists at these stations broadcasting in 5 languages, and they are aggressive about it. Think about, the U.S. VOA, Voice of America, which we have gotten away from, I think, sadly enough. But they have used that model and multiplied it, and now are having these conversations to try to sway people with psychological efforts, with public opinion efforts. And again, they're trying to make this public law case on why the United States is wrong. So China would be a victim of what countries like the United States are doing. And so when you start taking all of that and then you look at the way the military looks at it, and it's a force multiplier, and then apply it to what you see happening today. South China Sea, they're using all 3 of those, the 3 warfares. You look at information operations here in the United States, and we saw it a little bit, and the FBI came out and said, hey, guess what? China is in on the game. It's not just Russia. China's getting into this business of information operations, trying to convince Americans. And we should not like each other very much as Americans. And so those information operations, by the way, they learned from what the Russians were doing. And that's exactly what the Russians were trying to do, is create chaos and make us not believe in our institutions and make us believe that our neighbor who thinks a little differently than we do is now somehow an enemy of the United States, and we should hate each other and do horrible things. All of that was a Russian plan. We see the same kind of tactics with the Chinese, and they're getting better. Their cultural awareness of the United States is getting better. Their understanding of how you would craft messages to target Americans is getting better. Same in Europe, same in other places. So they are aggressively using those tactics to try to circumvent what we would understand which would be a normal defensive buildup. And so if you recall, again, my other great example of this is they realized once they decided that they weren't going to win these high-tech wars, at least in 2006, they were going to make the investment, they were going to use these 3 warfares, and then they were going to try to go after our Achilles heel, which was space. If you remember, in 2007, I happened to be the chairman. That's just a note you don't want to get when they walked in and said, guess what? They fired an anti-satellite missile and hit their target. And of course, a non-physicist, I was all thinking, wow, as an FBI guy, that's one heck of a good shot. But as a physicist told me, nope, that's just a math problem. You just line it up and it's going to be in the right place and you fire. Kind of blew my steam a little bit on what good shot that was to take out one of their own satellites. But the reason they did that, again, and then they broadcast it, they wanted us to see it. They shot one of their own satellites out of the sky, by the way. Was the fact that they wanted to convince the United States that our military-grade GPS system wasn't as good, and we shouldn't rely on this thing like we may have before. That's where they're going. You're going to see a lot more of it, and I look forward to the discussion today. Judge, thank you. Professor, thanks. And Ambassador, you, sir, are up next.
Well, thank you, Congressman, and it's a rare opportunity and a pleasure to be on such a distinguished panel, speaking in front of this audience. I was asked to speak about U.S.-Chinese relations, and uncharacteristically, I will do what I was asked. Just to give some historical context, we are now living in what you might call the 4th phase of the modern U.S.-China relationship. The first phase, which began during the Civil War, when the United States and the Communist Party were on opposite sides of the Chinese Civil War, going through the Korean War. Here we are today, marking Veterans Day. Well, American and Chinese troops were in direct contact with one another during the Korean War. And this phase of essential hostility did not come to an end until the end of the 1960s, when the old adage, the enemy of your enemy can be your friend, kicked in, and when the United States and the People's Republic of China both concluded that the threat posed by the Soviet Union was more acute than any bilateral difference they had. And what began then was a 2 decades long strategic reconciliation, if you will, ushered in by President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, where the United States and China found ways to manage their differences, finesse their differences, and cooperate to a limited extent. This second phase of the relationship ended with the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union disappeared, Cold War ended, and essentially the two countries had to come up with a new rationale for a third phase of the relationship. They did just that, and it was largely economic. And the whole idea was the two countries would become ever more integrated economically. China obviously saw it as essential for its growth, its development, maintain political stability. Americans were interested in access to this enormous market, but also there was the hope that by integrating China into the global economy, we could perhaps affect its own trajectory economically, politically, and in terms of its foreign policy. I would say this third phase came to an end over recent years. I can't give you a precise debate because it was gradual, not a switch, but essentially the economic relationship became as much a source of friction as it was cooperation. There was disillusionment with its impact on China. Clearly, China was not becoming more open politically, was not playing the economic game, quote unquote, by the rules. And so in this country, there was greater skepticism of China and this relationship. And that's the phase we're in now. I think it's too soon to give it a name, too soon to say exactly what its characteristics are, but that's where we are. And it's clearly one defined by considerably greater friction. I would say how this plays out has extraordinary consequences. This will be the defining relationship of this era of history. The U.S.-Soviet relationship was obviously the defining bilateral relationship for 4 decades of the Cold War. I would think for the next few decades of the 21st century, the U.S.-Chinese relationship will have enormous consequences, not just for the two countries, but really for the Asia-Pacific region and indeed for the world more broadly. What does China want in all this? Obviously, I think the party and the leadership is most concerned with their continued role in the country. They want China's continued rise economically, and the two are seen as connected. That China needs to continue to grow economically at a healthy clip in order for the party to continue to derive legitimacy. China wants its internal stability. It wants control also over what it considers to be, if you will, Greater China, Hong Kong, obviously Taiwan and contested border areas, islands, and so forth with many of its neighbors. I think that is the principal preoccupation of Chinese policy. Well, what about ourselves? What should we, the United States, want? I would say, more than anything else, our goal should be to influence how China uses its growing power. I think China will continue to grow economically, it'll continue to get stronger militarily. To me, the challenge for American foreign policy is to influence China, how China uses this greater capacity that they are developing. As an aside, I do not think it is realistic for us to stop China's rise. I also do not think, and here I disagree with the Secretary of State as recently as his comments yesterday, I do not believe the United States can essentially take on the role of the Communist Party and try to bring about political transformation in China or regime change. I think that is simply beyond the reach of the United States or traditional foreign policy, much as we essentially have come to the same conclusion with many other countries. Also, I would argue, if possible, we want to avoid direct conflict with China. And I'd say overall, the challenge for the United States is how do we push back where Chinese behavior gives us real grounds for concern, whether it's approach to human rights, whether it's its economic behavior, intellectual property theft, its assertiveness in the South China Sea, its threats to Taiwan, what it's doing vis-a-vis India and so forth. How do we push back in all these areas? At the same time, we try to avoid direct confrontation or conflict. And at the same time, one other goal would be, how do we try to still carve out or protect at least the possibility of limited cooperation where it is in our interest, for example, in curbing North Korean missile and nuclear capabilities. If there's any country in a position to do that, it's China, since the preponderance of North Korean trade transits China. How do we, for example, get China to cooperate on strengthening global health machinery, as we're seeing painfully when China does not cooperate or meet its obligations under global health regulations? We all potentially pay a price. How do we get China to change its trajectory on energy use so climate change does not suffer even more of an effect from what China is doing? So I think that it's a complicated challenge for foreign policy to push back where we have to, yet to do so in a way that hopefully doesn't preclude limited cooperation. And none of this is going to be easy, given that the contemporary China, Xi Jinping's China, is different. It is qualitatively different, say, than Deng Xiaoping's China. This is a much more repressive China. It is more statist economically. Hope that the state role in the economy would be reduced. Those hopes have not been borne out. And obviously, this is a much more assertive China. It has greater military capability, is much more willing to be active in the South China Sea, vis-a-vis its neighbors, and in the world with the, the Belt and Road Initiative. So how should we go about this foreign policy challenge? I would say, first and foremost, we should do it with allies. It's the great structural advantage of American foreign policy. Japan, South Korea, many of the countries in Europe, partners like India, countries like Vietnam. Unlike China, the United States has dozens of willing potential partners to push back against China in one or more domains, be they functional or geographic. I think also there's ways we have to compete with China. For example, in the amount of funds and how we spend them on basic research. We have to internationally be more competitive with the Belt and Road Initiative. Again, it doesn't have to be symmetrical. We have all sorts of tools that are available to us besides aid, things like trade policy. And then I also think we have to compete with China by the power of our example. We have to live up to our own rule of law. If we're going to be critical of China for what it's doing in Hong Kong, I would argue that American democracy has to be robust in every way. And I also think we need to be competent in everything we do. Our own approach, say, to COVID, I think is clearly, from my point of view, been largely a failure. And in some ways, the comparisons with China allowed Xi Jinping and the Chinese off the hook. We need to show, I believe, that democracy and the American economy, the American political system are capable, and that will get people in China to raise questions about the performance of their own system and their own leadership. So there is a competition, and in some ways we compete by what we do, but in some ways we compete by what we are. So why don't I leave it at that, and Judge or Your Honor, back to you.
Thank you all. Those were thought-provoking remarks, and I'm hoping that the audience is going to have a lot of questions, and I would advise the audience, if you would start thinking about what those questions might be. I do have a few questions for the panel, so I'm going to ask those questions first, but then I'll be kicking it over to the audience shortly. Let me start with Congressman Rogers. How, in China, the Chinese Communist Party the companies over there are state-owned or state-affiliated. So how has the Chinese Communist Party used or perhaps even abused the rule of law to support the efforts of these companies?
Yeah, great question, Your Honor. Thank you. So one of the things that has troubled many of us, matter of fact, my partner at the Intelligence Committee, Dutch Ruppersberger from Maryland, we launched the first investigation into Huawei and ZTE in about 2011, just to try to get some sense, could we pull all the intelligence together? Were they an arm of the Chinese Communist Party? Were they something different? Were they separate? Because we were getting all of this information that they in fact were an arm of the state. And absolutely what we found out in that report 2011 is the Communist Party of China decided that these companies needed to win. And what we saw them do is encourage and reward intellectual property theft, meaning if you can't beat them, steal it, and then repurpose it. We saw all of those activities. As a matter of fact, there's an FBI indictment out of New York that really details a lot of what Huawei was doing, including reward these points where Western companies or even trusted vendors of our Asian partners couldn't compete. I mean, there was deals where they would lay on the table that it will come in, we'll build out your network, we'll supply all the engineers. Oh, and by the way, you don't have to pay for 10 years. No independent company can compete with that. There's no way. You wouldn't have any cash flow for 10 years to do the deal. And why? Because the Chinese Communist Party decided that data dominance in 2025, which is their stated endgame, was more important than the profitability of these kinds of companies. So we have seen it across the board. They have different sectors of which the Chinese government will lay out and say, we need to lead in these areas, and we will lead. So go out and do it. And then, they're getting better at innovation. Still don't believe they're where we are, but through the taking of all that information and collecting that information, and then from using government resources and applying it to companies, it makes a horrifically unfair advantage. So I think it's A, illegal, B, it certainly doesn't meet to push back. I would love to be just a competitor economically with China, because I think we could do well, but we're not even close to that.
And before I move on to another question, I certainly did direct that at Congressman Rogers. Do any of the other panelists have any comments on that?
Just quickly on Huawei, I just want to point out that I think it's another example of the theme I was trying to make, which is that we've given Huawei, the whole procedure against Huawei has gone through these rigorous legal processes, and to the extent Huawei has been prosecuted, it's hired the best lawyers and has really defended itself and has been able to push back. But I think it's a fair way to treat it in a way that U.S. companies in China don't get that kind of fair treatment. And so it's the type of thing we should be emphasizing, that we treat Huawei, for all the problems, we treat them much better in many ways and much more fair in the United States than U.S. companies would typically get within China. And that should be something we should emphasize.
Professor, let me stay with you for a second, and certainly then open this question up to the rest of the panel. But we have U.S. businesses who are still doing business, and to a large extent, in China. Will U.S. businesses be able to criticize the Chinese government, and how can we protect them from any punishment that they might face in the Chinese market?
Yeah, this is a tough one, and I think that, look, it's in the U.S. interest for U.S. businesses to succeed and to make more money. This benefits the United States people as a whole. At the same time, I think once the deeper you get within China and the more dependent you are on China, the harder it is going to be able to push back against China. So a great example of this would be, how can you criticize the Chinese government's horrific treatment of its Uyghur Muslim minorities when you have, like the NBA, $100 million at stake, right? I mean, it's easy to say you should just condemn them, but you have $100 million at stake. So one thing I think we can do is the U.S. government can be helpful in making sure that restrict U.S. companies from doing bad things. And so give them the excuse by saying the U.S. government won't allow us to do it. So you can't do business in Xinjiang. You can't do business with people who conduct forced labor. And then if the Chinese government complains, the U.S. companies say, look, what can we do? The U.S. government is making us do that. In other words, it gives them a shield to say, well, it's not us, it's U.S. government. And I think that can be helpful. We also have the anti-boycott laws that we have. For instance, you can't participate in a boycott of Israel without violating U.S. law. And I think those types of laws can be helpful in trying to pressure U.S. companies not to participate in any boycotts the Chinese government forces them into. In other words, if they ever want them to boycott Hong Kong or boycott certain people, in order to benefit China, I think we can at least give signal to U.S. companies in the United States that that's going to be U.S. government will push back against that. Having said that, in the big picture, it's going to be hard because I think when you have a lot of money at stake, it's hard to balance those concerns, and you don't want to offend, you know, $1 billion, $100 billion market.
Any of the other panelists have any comments on that? Let me ask one more question to open up to the panel, and then I'll start the Q&A. We've talked about China and the US and its relationship. What about China exporting its version of authoritarian capitalism to other countries? What are the implications for the rule of law, and how should the United States deal with that export?
Well, China, why don't I start there? China is clearly trying to do that to some extent. If you look at its Belt and Road Initiative, it's doing a version of that in many countries, in some cases through some of the technology it is making available. Look, I think the best thing we can do there is compete in two ways. One is we have got to be on the field. And for a lot of countries in Africa in particular, but also in Latin America, the Middle East, we've got to give them, South Asia as well, we've got to give them a choice. We've got to give them alternatives. And we don't have to do it exactly the same way as China. I used the word before, asymmetrical. China's largely doing with large state loans. We have lots of other tools at our disposal. It could be inviting certain students from around the world to come here. It could be various types of trade arrangements, investments, sharing of certain select technologies. We can do just fine in competing with China in the field. And then second of all, and it echoes something I alluded to, there is a degree of competition between China's authoritarian model and our democratic, more market-oriented model. It's interesting when things recently, when we had violence in the streets here and so forth in recent months, China would show those images on state television, and it would basically use it as a defense or rationale of their very controlled society. And I think the best way to compete with that sort of a message is to show that our more open society is able to peacefully address its shortcomings, to show that we can be economically productive, to essentially live up to our principles and values. And if we do that, that's the best way I know, in some ways, to pressure China. It's by the power and appeal of our performance, the power and appeal of our example.
Thank you. Anyone else on the panel?
No, I'll just jump in quick. I agree with the ambassador. I will say one interesting thing on this, the data dominance piece, because it relates to this and why the uproar over TikTok. It's because all of that data, from your geolocation to your purchase habits, to your viewing habits, to your friends, all of that data feeds in through Beijing. And why is that important? If you want to know why they're winning the AI war, you hear, people come out and say the artificial intelligence algorithms of China are better. Well, they're not necessarily better, but imagine if I have a 900 million base data set and I have maybe 1,000 points of data on each one of those 900 million, my algorithm gets smarter as it goes. That's what a whole argument about why we should not allow China to control this data. And what do they do with it internally that they'd like to the Communist Party of China assigns a score, and what they did last year, they rejected millions of Chinese ability to buy a bus ticket or a plane ticket or a train ticket inside of China, not external, inside, because they didn't score well enough according to the government of China. That's Orwellian. It's happening now. It's not 10 years from now. That ought to give the hair on the back of the neck of everybody watching this program. We just don't talk about it enough. And so they are trying to export that. So imagine Mike Rogers has a new business. I want to do business in China, which I agree with the professor. We should try to encourage American style business with American values and and they said, well, you were at the Federalist Society, the National Lawyers Convention, and said, you said some things that made us mad. Guess what? You don't get a contract in China, even if it's a private company. And so that is what they're trying to export. It is a soft authoritarian approach that I do think we're going to have to pay attention. I think there's lots of ways we can push back, and I agree with the ambassador on that. There's a whole series of things we would need to do, but absolutely they're doing it, and they're not doing it directly necessarily. They're doing it in this kind of soft way of pushing out their ideas and beliefs by controlling people's data and information.
Thank you. All right, we're going to start the audience Q&A part. And before we get into that, the moment that everybody has been waiting for, the CLE password is INT10. And just a reminder to the audience that we're only taking questions from those who are watching this panel from a Zoom platform, not any of the other platforms. And at this point, if you have a question and you're here through Zoom video, please use the raise hand button on the lower middle screen. And if you're a phone participant, you should dial *9. All right, we have a question from John Goose. Please make sure to unmute your line.
Sorry, I don't know how that happened. I don't have a question. I didn't think I pushed any buttons either. Sorry.
Okay, moving on to Christopher Melling. Do you have a question?
Yes, this is Christopher Melling, BYU Law. Maybe I'm being unfair, but we've talked about some of China's specific actions through the Confucius Institute, educational system, other activities. Are we seeing a case where Americans are being complicit, willfully ignorant, maybe just not seeing China as a competitor? I mean, I would love to hear your perspective. Like, what is the general conventional wisdom? I mean, is it the fact that a lot of people just don't view China as a threat and, see what they're doing and why they're doing these things? If you could I would love to hear your comments on that. Thank you.
Can I start with that? Or? Yeah, I think that just a quick thought on this one, which is that I think it's mixed, right? I think the last 4 years we have seen a really dramatic shift in U.S. public opinion about China. It's been really dramatic. But up until then, I think, look, we are interrelated with China. And we have 300,000 Chinese students in U.S. universities every year, more. We have incredible trade and travel and cultural links and family, like my own family. Like there's a lot of links. And so I think we don't see China historically in the same way. But I think that's changing. I think what's changing is really viewing China as a threat. And that's been a shift among the elites and is starting to trickle down to individuals. And I think this has occurred in part because of the Trump administration policies, which has really called out China and made it more public.
And Professor Koo, did you have a question for the co-panelists before I go back to the audience?
Yeah, I know Ambassador Haass did you want to address what I just said? Or?
No, go ahead.
Okay. I did have a question. I didn't want to. This is actually for both Ambassador Haass and Congressman Rogers, which is, here's a good example of how we might go forward. There's a bill in Congress, a resolution seeking to declare China as committing genocide in its northwest province of Xinjiang because of its treatment of the Uyghurs. Now, as a legal matter, this is a little tricky because cultural genocide is a little bit harder to define. Essentially, they're trying to make people give up their beliefs, give up their culture, give up their language, which is really, really bad, and imprisoning them and forcing them to do so. But Ambassador Haass, I was curious, is that the type of thing where if a unilateral declaration by the United States would do more harm than good? Or what if the US government started prosecuting Chinese people who are involved in the genocide, which we do have that possibility under our laws? In fact, we'd be required to do so if they came within US jurisdiction. Or is it something that we should try to build allies support for before making such a determination? Because at the one time, turning a blind eye to it and doing the Olympics and doing all the good stuff with them is one thing, but then, it's a possible serious genocide. How do we approach that going forward?
Look, you raise a good question. There's two things of late. One is what you're talking about, what they're doing vis-a-vis the Uyghur minority. The other is Hong Kong. China entered into international legal obligations in the handover agreement from the United Kingdom, and they've essentially violated them. One country, two systems is now one country, one system. And so we've now seen two areas. I'm not a lawyer. Virtually everybody else in the Zoom meeting is a lawyer, but we've had two areas where China has contravened either its own obligations that it took on or international obligations. I think the question with genocide is a tactical one. One is the question of if we were to try to get multilateral support, how much could we get? We wouldn't want to turn it into a debate between ourselves and others. The second of all, if we were to do it, what things would go into gear? What would it require us to do? What would it preclude us from doing? So to me, maybe I'm overly practical here. To me, is less a judgment than what China is doing. And by the way, we don't need a formal declaration of genocide to be strongly critical of what China is doing in all sorts of fora that deal with human rights and the rest. To me, it's really a pragmatic question. If we were to go in the direction of a formal declaration, would on balance it serve the ends of American foreign policy? Would on balance it do anything to change Chinese behavior vis-a-vis these people who are being treated so harshly and unfairly? And to be perfectly honest, I don't know enough about the actual consequences of going down that path. But I think you raised a big point. I'd only want to go down it if I were persuaded that it couldn't be packaged as a U.S. China issue, but instead much more the world against China. And I just say one other thing. It's been a little bit disappointing about how much of the Muslim world has not been willing to push back against China. And this shows to me how China has insulated itself through Belt and Road, through a lot of its economic initiatives. A lot of the world is quite honestly, it's not that it simply doesn't want to choose between us and China, but often it's quite reluctant to take China on.
Yeah, Professor, I agree with the ambassador. I would not support a genocide. Once you start cheapening what genocide means, I think it causes more difficulties down the road to actually target real genocide. I do think this has to be an international coalition, and I would start with our Middle East partners, the Arab League specifically, to do this. And what we have seen China do is that they will use economic extortion to get people not to talk about these things. And I think that's what the ambassador was referring to. We've seen it. We've seen it with their 5G build out. We've seen it with other matters when Canada talked about some human rights problems in China. China threatened that they wouldn't buy any more lumber for so many months. I mean, so they are really aggressive on this. I just think we have to be aggressive back. But genocide to me, boy, I just hope we don't cheapen the term. It is horrific what happens in a true genocide. I just don't think this rises to that standard. We ought to protect that for those issues.
All right, let me turn back to the audience. And in the interest of full disclosure, this person in the audience is a friend of mine. Irene Munn, please mute your line. Unmute your line, sorry. Irene? You're still muted. There we go.
Yeah, I think I've unmuted. Sorry, it took me a moment. Yes, my question is China's rise inevitable, as well as who are our best allies around the world as it relates to this conversation?
Why don't I maybe start and then invite others? Is China's rise inevitable? It's a great question. In my experience, nothing is inevitable in the course of history. China has had extraordinary 3-4 decades of economic growth, but that growth is already slowing. It's temporarily somewhat higher now coming out of the COVID recession, but that won't be sustainable. So I think you're seeing a slowing down. And one question is, as China slows down economically, what are the implications of that for political stability within China? China also faces all sorts of challenges. One is demographic. The delayed effects of the one-child policy will be quite extraordinary. China is going to get much older. Its population will ultimately begin to shrink. And the ratio of working age to non-working age will move in directions that will not be good for the society. China's had massive environmental degradation. And one consequence of that is a massive public health problem. China has a very concentrated politics. The fact that Xi Jinping has abolished term limits and has done his anti-corruption drive, he has consolidated power in his hands tremendously, which is both a source of strength, but also of weakness. particularly if things begin to go off the rails. So I can't sit here and again, I'm not going to say I'm a China expert. I'm a generalist who knows something about China. But if you read the China experts, there's a wide range of views about what China's future is going to be. I don't assume a lot, and I would just simply say it's hard to imagine though that its future unfolds without some major speed bumps, and I think they nearly had one when COVID broke out, and I think they've managed their way through it, but that was potentially a real challenge to the stability of China, but I think they have largely worked their way through it. In terms of allies, I think it's different partners for different purposes. But obviously, the Asian allies from Japan, South Korea are central. You got partners like India, to some extent, Vietnam, Australia is an ally here. I think the European countries could be real allies in the technology realm. I think they could be real allies and partners in criticizing China on human rights. I think they could be real allies and partners in criticizing China for its growing dependence upon coal as a source of energy. So I actually think if we go about it, and among other things, I would love for the United States to reconsider its decision not to join what was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is a group that represents, if we were to join it, 45% of the world economy. And if we were to be in it, this would be a great way to confront China. Basically, you want to export to half the world. Here are the standards you have to meet. Here's what you have to do in terms of respecting intellectual property. Here's maybe what you have to do about human rights. Here's what you have to do about climate. So what we ought to be doing is looking for ways where we can pool our leverage against China. And that ought to be one of the things we look at really closely.
Anyone else on the panel want to respond?
I like the ambassador's optimism. What is not is, are they going to be necessary? I'm giving you a great example. The Department of Defense yesterday was saying that by 2035, 90% of all communications telecom equipment, and they're talking chips and boards and motherboards and FPGAs, 90% by 2035 on its current trajectory will be built in China. Remember what I talked about controlling data. If I can control what's in your phone and your computer, I'm likely to have a better understanding how I access it and get the things I need. So my argument is, yep, they're going to be on the rise. They're going to be a major manufacturing player for at least the foreseeable future. How do we build back the ability? And I was a TPP supporter for that reason. I thought it was the one quickest, best way we could start to leverage up against China. So yep, they're going to rise. They listen to their white papers on their military dominance. They'll tell you exactly what they want to do, when they want to do it. And they've met every deadline. So from 2020 to 2040, they want to start pushing the U.S. out of the dominant player in the Navy in the Pacific. And so that's pretty tall order. Well, they're on their way to do that with the technology they invested in. So they're moving out that way. And my argument is we better just step up our game. So, yep, they're going to be big players. I would love to be selling American products in China in 10 years on an equal competitive environment. That's not going to happen by itself. And so we've got a lot of work to do to get there. But we also need to understand we're going to be dealing with them as near peers, both in nuclear and NATO.
Can I just piggyback on one thing the Congressman said, which is, this to me is an argument for close relations between the United States and Taiwan, given how important Taiwan is in the global chip production market. And also we have got to think, and by we, I mean the United States, our European economic partners together, we represent nearly half the world's economy. Some of our partners in Asia, like Japan, we've got to think about supply chain resiliency. And we have got to have a very focused conversation about in what items, what technologies are we not prepared to share with China? What items, what technologies do we not want to be dependent on China? And where we decide not to be dependent on China for certain technologies. And so if the question is, how do we build reliable arrangements among ourselves? What kind of stockpiles do we create here at home? What kind of national production do we mandate? That is the sort of conversation we need to have. And by the way, I am optimistic on that. I actually think, Congressman, maybe you know much better than I do, Mike, but I would think that might be an area of potentially bipartisan support. I could see on the Hill people in both parties coming together to think really strategically about just this question, about what is our resilience require in a way so we reduce our dependence on China in a way that also, though, makes not just strategic, but also economic sense.
And before we go to another audience question, Professor, do you have any comment you want to give on this topic? Let's turn back to the audience. Seth Cohen, please unmute your line.
Hi, my name's Seth Cohen. Next year, I'm going to be clerking for Judge Branch. So my question is about the extent to which this stuff can be accomplished, or at least furthered through market reforms. So one of the big stories of the Cold War, right, was propping up liberalization efforts throughout the world through, economic policy. Today, one of the things that we're seeing really emerge in American financial markets, and putting aside the difficulties with this sort of movement, is ESG. And I'm wondering, to what extent you all think that increased calls on American companies doing business in China or with Chinese companies can help sort of exert some of the pressures that you're talking about already, like, establishing alternative supply chains.
Well, I'll take a stab at this. And Seth, the judge said if the question didn't go well, I got news for you. Just kidding. Just kidding. Come on. Got to have some fun on this thing. I'll take a question on this because we ran into this a little bit because of some of the pushing back on privacy proposals across Europe. And so what they found is some of those privacy proposals were so completely 180 degrees inconsistent with the way the Chinese companies were expected to act. As a matter of fact, there's a national security law in China that says any company that's a Chinese company operating anywhere in the world, all of its data, they don't have to have a court order. They don't have to have a subpoena. If the intelligence services show up and say, give us the data on all of those people, they have to do it. So I do think that the ESG conversation is going to become more relevant in companies doing business there. As people understand where China is on their ESG level, I would argue, listen, this is no more a developing country. This is a sophisticated country that is lifted out, by the way, 650 million people out of poverty using some kind of a, their modified view of capitalism, authoritarian capitalism. That part's probably good. Now people are exposed to that. Now it's our opportunity as consumers to start understanding, hey, if we're living by ESG standards, so should they. And so I think you're going to see more of that. It's just going to take a little bit. But remember, they carry a big stick in economic. They do not like people telling them what they're doing. And so economic extortion, I think, is the one challenge we have. And we've seen it in every policy issue, actually, we've talked about today, where you bump into that economic extortion to say, whoop, the Uyghurs? Nope, you can't talk about that. That's a Chinese problem. We'll handle it. And so I think we're going to run into more of that and more consumer awareness. And then I think we actually start making a dent on that ESG question in China.
Do any of the other panelists want to respond?
I would just say that besides human rights, I would think the other area where ESG could come to target China a bit would be the environment and climate issues. China's climate trajectory, if one looks at the plans that have recently been released, are really worrisome. Given it's not the scale of the growth so much as the approach to energy and a really large coal component. And I would just think that, no pun intended, that climate concerns fuel are one of the powerful fuels of ESG. And I would think that would be a potential concern in addition to what's going on in Hong Kong and the Uyghurs. So I would not be surprised. Actually, I put it the other way. I would be surprised if we did not begin to see these concerns pop up a little bit more into shareholder or stakeholder conversations.
Professor? Let me turn back to the audience. Carl Helmar, if you would unmute your line, please.
I'm
Carl?
a brand new attorney. Can you hear me, Judge?
Yes.
My name is Carl Peterson. I'm a brand new attorney and I'm a returned Peace Corps volunteer. I served in China from 2014 to 2017. My question is regarding the Belt and Road Initiative. It's China's premier international relations program, and it's largely building infrastructure across Africa and Central Asia. Do the panelists think that the United States and other nations can counter the BRI through creating and bolstering good governance in Africa and Central Asia through innovative solutions like charter cities?
Well, this gives me 30 seconds to talk about something we're doing at the Council on Foreign Relations. Our next task force report, it's a commission, is on how we should understand the Belt and Road Initiative and how the United States ought to counter it. And I take it seriously in terms of what China's doing with its economic reach, but using it both to promote its political system and to gain influence, to gain access. So I take it seriously. And I think we have to be, again, we don't have to do what they're doing in order to compete with them. We have all sorts of, I think, structural advantages in the United States, but I think we need to make it more of a priority to compete with Belt and Road, and also put more pressure on China for those aspects of Belt and Road, which are really making situations worse for many countries, which is putting them in real difficult loan repayment situation. But I think, again, we have all sorts of assets in terms of technology, trade, exchange programs, and so forth. So what we need is a comprehensive approach, in some cases country by country, in some cases globally, to compete with Belt and Road. And Peace Corps, by the way, is a perfect example of one of the tools we have. This is a sensational program, and that's one of the things we can and should deploy.
I just quickly jump in on this. One thing is always keep in mind when you talk about these gigantic Chinese projects is that the Chinese government is not infallible. They make mistakes all the time, and they could very well have overreached themselves and let the BRI gotten out of control, and they themselves could find themselves in deep trouble in giving out loans that they're not going to get paid back on, which will put them. So it's, I think a little bit what the psychological warfare thing. Sometimes we build up China as this incredibly effective government apparatus, which it is in some ways, but they're not infallible. They do make mistakes, and I think this could very well be one of them.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in here. We have, I think, America has just done a terrible job on crafting and embracing and maintaining good policy in Africa to our peril. I mean, I could tell you story after story of my trips there, and African ambassadors here coming to us saying, please, would America get involved? So I would pick off one or two countries in Africa that we think we can make a big impact and show, right? Sometimes we want to fix all of it all at the same time. And China just goes in candidly with suitcases full of cash and gets their way. I mean, they underbid, bribery is a part of their culture in getting that business across Africa and the Middle East. And so we can combat that, but I don't think we fix it all at once. I think we find a few places in Africa where we can go in, train their law enforcement community, which is a big State Department project, re-engage Exim Bank and its ability to provide funds for American businesses to operate there competitively.
We're also, I don't know if we've lost Mike again for a second.
Sorry.
Can I say one thing to what I think we can also do, and it's going to be available in the next 6 months or 8 months, which is as vaccines get developed in the United States to deal with COVID-19, if we were to make them available, join these various international initiatives and make some of the vaccines available in Africa and other parts of the world, I think that would do extraordinary good in terms of banking goodwill, in terms of helping these societies recover economically, helping the global public health challenge, because again, they will help them recover there. So we are going to have a massive opportunity in 2021 to use, I believe, vaccine technology, take advantage of it. And if we share it and make it available on terms that people can afford, I think that is a made-to-order opportunity for the United States and much of the world.
And this has been such a great discussion. I hate to end it, but we're coming up on a hard stop in about a minute. But somehow it does seem appropriate to end the discussion, a 2020 conference with a discussion about COVID-19. So perhaps that is the ideal stopping point. I do want to thank the panelists, gentlemen. It was a pleasure serving on this panel with you today, and certainly want to thank the audience for joining us. And also a reminder, two things. One, the CLE password, again, INT10. And the next convention event is a discussion of agency leaders on labor policy, and it will begin at 12:30. And thank you all again.
Thanks, Judge.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Enjoyed it.
Thanks, Professor. Thanks, Ambassador.
Nice to meet you guys.